Welcome, Paul. Amazing backdrop.
Oh, unfortunately, well, or fortunately, that's my office.
That's not the home office anymore. You're out of the living room.
No, I'm in the real office today.
Very nice. And that's Pittsburgh, not Harrisburg, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and not quite the same skyline here. So welcome here, Paul. I want to do a quick introduction, then you can fill it in. Paul Welk is an attorney, transactional attorney with Tucker and Arensberg. We've worked with Tucker and Arensberg for 17, 18 years now, pretty much my entire private practice career. Paul is a husband, a father. I think your son is 9. Is that right?
That's pretty good.
Okay, great. 9 years old. And yeah, Paul is a physical therapist and an attorney as well. And probably out of anybody I've ever talked with, handles the largest deal flow from both ends, from buyer and seller, and the entire private practice physical therapy M&A space. Anything you'd like to add in there, Paul?
No, that sounds like you've just about covered it. So I look forward to answering some questions. I'm sure you've got some good ones.
Great. So, and by the way, for anybody that's watching this right now, if you do have a question, just type it in the Q&A, and I'll help moderate here. So our session specifically is called Top 3 Things Driving the Value of Your Practice Today, a Transactional Attorney's Perspective. Paul, I know 5 or 6 years ago, we released a training, I think it was called I Want to Sell My Practice in 2 to 5 Years, and you listed, I think it was 14 variables that drive practice value. And obviously EBITDA was in there, new patient sources, number of locations, number of therapists, et cetera. Can you talk about over the last 12 months, how that has changed or how that has like more narrowly focused to the 3 categories? And then I'll dive deeper once you share everybody the top 3 things.
Sure. I guess, at the end of the day, it ultimately comes down to, and I caught part of Bob's discussion here, presentation just beforehand, and I think it was a good, lead into this about, driving the financial metrics of the practice and ultimately maintaining that EBITDA number. Because at the end of the day, and we'll talk about some of these factors, I mean, that still remains, again, these are all, my views from the transactional side and what I see. I think at the end of the day, the EBITDA is what drives it. And I think what we've seen over the last, 12 months or whatever the number is, with the onset of COVID and with changes in reimbursement, and maybe I'll speak to COVID first, it's really been the ability of a practice to be nimble and ultimately work their way through that process and continue to work their way through that process. I know we've got folks in different areas of the country where you're subject to different restrictions, but it's really kind of, have you been able to maintain that number when you think about the value of the practice? And if you haven't been able to maintain, your historical EBITDA number or, ultimately grow it, sort of what's the rationale behind that? And we know some of the key drivers, but ultimately, can you show that you can return? And what I mean by that is when you look at values, if you were going out to sell your practice today, probably not many of the folks on this presentation would say, well, the last 12 months is a good reflection of what my practice is worth. So I think where we've seen a big value driver or a big, step to closing a transaction is showing that, I've essentially returned or show a trend towards returning. I think what we see a lot of potential, purchasers or folks involved in transactions looking at, can I return to 90%, for example, of a what I'll call a pre-COVID number as a reflection that my practice is back or that I'm back on track, so that I can justify, a valuation for my practice that might not be reflective, consistent with what we would see historically. So I don't know, maybe we'll pause there, Chad, and see if you've got any questions on that piece.
So factor number 1, it sounds like, is resiliency, ability to bounce back.
Yeah, I would say so. Resiliency, and then ultimately, tying that through to the financial metrics and how they reflect on the practice, whether it's financial or operational, to show that, my financial performance may be lagging, but here's what I have in the pipeline to bring it back to where it was.
So for those of you that are watching right now, and I think this is where there's a uniqueness here with Paul's experience that I'm hoping our viewers can really tap into here. But he represents at different times both the buyer and or the seller, right? You've been on both sides.
Right.
So you understand both perspectives really well. The resiliency, and you could think about this if you're an acquirer, right? If you're a USPH, Chris Redding was just on here before you, Paul. So, if you're an acquirer, why that would be important. So, your ability to run and manage a business through a stressful time, right? A non-optimum economic time. We have restrictions. We have, clear shower curtains between all the treatment tables and all that fun stuff. We're trying to mitigate all the changes that happened last year. Think through why that would be important from the acquirer's perspective. And I think that's a viewpoint that we frequently don't look at. So is there another place or something else you had in mind there, Paul, relative to resiliency?
No, I think you've hit it on the head. I think the other piece tied to resiliency is sort of doing a deep dive and seeing where you can improve. I think I've talked to a number of practice owners that have said to me, boy, I would never want to go through the last year again, but it's been a great thing for my business. And they've taken the opportunity to say, for example, I always thought I was a little bit overstaffed on the administrative side, or I always knew that this physical therapist wasn't really cutting it like I hoped in my practice, or I always wanted to look at this, revisit this payer contract and see if we couldn't have a discussion with the payer and get our reimbursement up a little bit. And I think this has really forced people by necessity to do the things that they probably always knew they should have done, but now there's been a fire underneath them because they have to do it. And again, I know many of you out there are living through this, but I hear that with great frequency. Is this has caused me to do the things I should have done 12 months ago.
Yeah, business autophagy, I think, is how one of my partners put it. So that's great. So I don't see any questions that are in right now on the resiliency getting back to normal. I lied. One just came in. So Pradeep, this may have been answered before. How do I find practices that want to sell in my geographic area? And what is the first step once I have a potential acquisition?
I guess in terms of, depending on the size of your practice, if you are a smaller practice, I think it's somewhat knowing your market and trying to, identify colleagues that might be in that spot in their career. So for example, we have a number of practices. The typical demographic, at least historically, of a physical therapy private practice has been one owner without a succession plan. So I'm sure all of you, and there may be a lot of you on the call, but from a practical standpoint, when you're looking at identification of possible practices to join with you or acquire, we've seen, I think, an increase in approaching that one owner, nearing retirement age, who really doesn't have an exit strategy and may look to you as a fellow practitioner in the area to say, hey, maybe we can come together. You can, pay me a fair price for my practice, and I can, transition out and have an exit through you. I think it's mostly, most of you aren't in a position where you'd go out and hire a firm to say, go find me targets to acquire. So that is an option, but I think it's probably for the, most smaller private practices not there. I think it's through networking events and knowing the market. And then I think the second part of the question was, well, sort of what do I do if I get to that point? I think what the first step is usually, I kind of think of it like cups of coffee. So if Chad and I were talking and he said, hey, Paul, I'd like to buy your practice. I always think of it as, okay, I'm willing to sort of sit down and have a cup of coffee with Chad and not share too much about my business, but enough to see if it's worth that second cup of coffee. And I think if it is, that's when you get that, non-disclosure confidentiality agreement and start to share information so that you can determine what you think you pay for the practice and they can figure out whether they think that's a fair deal, and you keep talking.
Yeah, and just a personal share, Pradeep. I've been in this situation, not with an external acquisition, but internally, and I just relentlessly text Paul until he shows up for the second cup of coffee. That's what I would do, and we'll get Paul's contact in here later. Pradeep says thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so number one, ability to bounce back to normal, get lean during lean times, and still keep the doors open and run a successful, valuable practice. What's point number two that our owners should focus on?
Sure. I think when you think about, value in the practice, probably your largest asset, if you really think about it, is your staff. And so what I think about, or what I see in these transactions, is how buyers and sellers view a well-trained, long-term retention, staff that has a positive culture. And you can't put a dollar sign on culture, but I've seen many folks that have walked away from potential transactions because any one of a variety of factors that I think sort of tie into this kind of cultural, staff, community, reputation. When you think about a practice, largely what you're buying is the goodwill of that business. So when you think of a physical therapy practice, it's, and all of you have equipment in your space, it's not like you're buying a business that owns $1 million MRI unit. I mean, the equipment in and of itself is not where the value is. The value is in the business itself as a going concern. And essentially what I'll summarize is kind of your reputation in the community, which I think is largely driven by staff and the qualifications of the staff that you are able to attract and employ.
Great. So never thought about this before, but if I were looking to sell, do you know anybody that has ever had like an employee roster with longevity? And are there any, how could we show a potential acquirer, how could we demonstrate that to a potential acquirer, that the goodwill that we have with our teams, with our staff?
I think depending on the way that the sort of sale is structured, I think you either, if you're going out with a large kind of informational packet on the front side, you can include that within the highlights of the practice. For example, X percentage of our staff have an advanced, OCS, et cetera, depending on the nature of your practice, or, we're all DPTs, or those type of things that you think are valuable to your practice. So, not suggesting a DPT is more valuable than another one, but, somebody may look at it in today's market and say, hey, I like this. I like the approach. I like the importance that this practice has set, for example, on continuing education. So I think, on every one of these transactions, at some point, you're going to provide an employee roster. And I think it doesn't hurt to include that information and talk about it up front. Talk about the value of your staff and what they mean to the practice. And if they've been there for 20 years, that probably means you're a good place to work.
Wonderful. So number one was resiliency. Number two is team or your staff. What's number three?
I think number three, and like I said, I got a little bit of Bob's there, but if someone is looking at your practice, I think he might have mentioned scalability or systems or those type of words. But when you think about it, many buyers out there in the market are not buying your practice to say, Chad, I'd love to buy your practice. And when I buy it, I don't want you to grow at all. I just want you to do exactly what you've been doing. And in 20 years, we'll be in the same spot. Most are doing it, as I assume would anybody out here that's participating that would say, I'd like to buy a practice or I'd like to grow my own practice. Stagnant practices are probably not the most attractive. Again, I'm not suggesting you have to have gone from one office, to 5 to be desirable. But I do think sort of showing that you have processes in place that can allow your practice to run efficiently and run well and maybe add on that second office because you say, okay, here's what I've got in place from a compensation structure. Here's how my management runs. You know, I can plug in another office and be able to handle that with my systems if that's your plan. But I think just showing that you've got the ability to do those things makes you more attractive to a potential acquirer.
Got it. So pretty classic. Resiliency, team, systems. Pretty fair summary so far?
Yeah, I think it is. And again, as you indicated, there's a wide variety of factors. I think I'll go back to the first one, because when you first think about getting that offer, there's not a lot of information that's typically exchanged before that first number comes across. If I pretend I'm the seller, I may provide some tax returns, some revenue numbers, some reimbursement per visit, those type of metrics. But I think sort of getting out in front of that process and really selling the value of your practice early on, or once you get that letter of intent, if you think there's room to negotiate, to go back to some of these things that that we've talked about.
Great. So along those lines, within the marketplace today, I tried, I was looking for if you had any recent interviews. The latest I could find was like May or June of this year. But what are you seeing within the marketplace right now? What's the pulse look like? I know when you and I talked in preparation for this event, you had shared that there's life again in terms of deal flow. So can you shed some light on that in terms of what you see right now within the marketplace?
We're still seeing a large volume of transactional work that's coming through in our office, and we're still seeing healthy multiples for practices. I think the biggest hurdle to overcome, sort of back a little bit to what we talked about in the beginning, is talking, sort of explaining, and I don't think there's a lot of explaining necessary in most cases, why your last 12 months looks the way it does. But every market is a little bit different. So you may have some nuances as to decisions that you made, or, government orders that affected how your practice was able to operate, but really showing that you've been able to bounce back. We'll go back to your word, resiliency, showing that you've been able to come back. And I think we've seen different things in recent transactions. So, do you see something that's got a little bit more of maybe an earnout component that says, okay, you're telling me you're back. I think you're back, but I'm going to hold back some of my price that I'm going to pay to you, Chad, until you really prove to me, from a bottom line perspective, that I'm getting what I think I'm buying, based on your historic numbers, or pre-COVID numbers, if you will.
Okay, so just quick example: if I'm selling my practice to you for $1 million, I might not get $1 million at the closing table. I might get, say, 700, and we have 300,000 in escrow that's released to me later once I prove the performance of the company.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable example, especially if I'm paying you on what you're telling me your old numbers reflected $1 million and your current numbers reflect 700, and you tell me, hey, Paul, I'm there. I might say, okay, I'll, prove it to me. I'd like to do the deal. And if you show me at the end of the day, again, we're not seeing that across the board, but I've seen that in more transactions. And I think we'll look at people start to add some nuances, because if you think about it from the buyer's perspective, I don't want to overpay for something. I want to pay you fairly. And if you are delivering to me the EBITDA that you said you were, then I think that's how people are dealing with that.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. So question from Mike Strakel. Paul, can you articulate what the multiples are by practice size or revenue? So,
yeah.
Well, just not to hang you out, but I can at least share what Chris shared from his perspective.
Oh, that would be good, because he's a lot smarter than me. So let's hear what he said.
Come on. So, well, he gave an ascending rate. So he said, we're seeing deals in the 5, 6, 7, or 8 multiple, is what I wrote down. Hopefully I got that right, but in that range. So, and I think that depends on EBITDA and practice size as well. But if you could shed some light on that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly concur with that. I think in terms of most of the deals that are coming across my desk, obviously, if you've got a smaller practice, with significantly lower revenues, you're probably not going to get that 5 multiple. As Chad said, on a past discussion that he and I had, we went through sort of all of those factors that may push you up or down a quarter multiple or a half turn, or however you choose to describe that. But I think fair, and I don't want to necessarily state the obvious, but I mean, EBITDA is the biggest driver. So if you've got a practice, it's interesting to me, and as I've done a large volume of these at this point, bigger isn't always better when it comes to practices in terms of numbers and staff and locations. It really comes down to that, as the primary driver in my experience, the EBITDA number. I worked on transactions that have 4 locations that the valuation of the practice was more than somebody that has 25, because they've run them extremely well. They're very efficient in a good reimbursement market. So I think for those of you out there that are small practices, and again, we've certainly all have, challenges, and I know we've talked about a number of those already. I think when you think about that, it's really what you're able to kind of drive to that bottom line that will affect your practice. And don't go into it with the perspective of, who'd want to buy one practice. Because what I'm still seeing is there's a fair amount of people that would, or buy a 1, 2, 3, whatever that is. There's still a very viable market, in my experience, for, smaller practices in terms of numbers.
Yep. So let's talk real numbers here for a second. So I have a practice, 300K in EBITDA. Because, and Chris did this as well, smaller or larger, just as a point of reference. So my EBITDA is 300K. What range of multiple could I expect?
I mean, I think if we're following through the discussion on Chris's range, I mean, in my experience, you're going to be on the smaller end of that. So you're going to be, again, in a typical deal, you're going to be closer to the 5 end of the spectrum, I think, than he described, than the 8 end when you're at that number.
Yeah. Are you seeing anything smaller than 5?
I have, but again, it's always tough. And I know people want to know what their practice is worth. It's always a little difficult to generalize. We've definitely seen smaller numbers than that. But I think if you're at 300,000, I think that puts you near the bottom of that range.
Got it. So now my EBITDA, magic, and we're up to 600K. I want everybody to see the direct relationship between EBITDA and multiple.
Yeah.
So is it the same thing? Is it now maybe?
Oh no. I mean, you're probably going to be at least kind of one, they'll call it like 1 turn. So I would think you'd go up if your original example was same practice, same location, and you're going from a 300,000 to a 600,000. I think you've got to be up at, a good multiple, if not more, in terms of valuation. Now, obviously you compress that because, at some point, even if your EBITDA is 5 million, you're not at a 25, right? So there's kind of, if you will, there's more movement there, probably from, if this makes sense, from $10 of EBITDA to $1 million or 2 million. And then you really kind of get more compressed at the top because, the numbers get so large.
Yeah, fair enough. And then, what would be like the EBITDA threshold for like an 8 or somebody dreamy and hyper aggressive like myself that wants a 10?
Yeah, my guess is this is recorded. It'll be on the internet forever.
And also this is reflective of today's marketplace. So if you're watching this in 2041 or something like that, it might not be relevant.
I mean, if you're looking at it for a 10 multiple, and you've forced me to give a number, which I feel like you're doing, I would say you'd be probably in maybe the 3 million-ish range of EBITDA.
Very good.
I mean, you've got to get a pretty big number if you think you're going to be in that range.
Perfect. Thanks for playing, Paul.
I'm not sure if I won or lost, but I'm glad I played.
You definitely won. That was great. So this is from anonymous attendee. What valuation consideration is there when staff are independent contractors versus employees?
I think it ultimately goes in a situation like that. I think you're still going to look at, longevity. I think at the end of the day, in the financials, the expense for your labor is going to come through and be reflected in that EBITDA number. I think from a compliance review standpoint, a buyer is going to want to make sure that they are comfortable that the folks are appropriately classified. So we've definitely had transactions where buyers have been uncomfortable with independent contractor classifications and have required people to change to either employees or no longer work with the practice. So as everybody probably knows, there's a fine line between when you can treat somebody as a contractor for IRS purposes. So you just need to make sure that you're comfortable. I think that's probably the bigger risk. If you said all of my therapists are contractors, and again, it's certainly supportable. I'm not suggesting that the individual is doing it wrong, but you need to be able to support that, because there are buyers that would say, I don't like that model because I'm not comfortable with the risk under the classification.
Yeah, very fair. And it seems there seems to be a thread of alignment. So from billing structure, compensation models, I think it all falls under the umbrella of culture and how we do business, that there should be some sort of alignment between the buyer and seller. Otherwise, there's going to be some money to mitigate that, right? Money and time.
Right.
Yep. Another follow-up question from Mike. Mike's on fire here this morning. Can you explain how most transactions are structured for the seller once you've agreed upon the price?
If you've got I guess there's a couple of ways these deals could be structured. You can structure them as an asset sale. Those are fairly common, especially if you've got a buyer, for example, that's established in the market and has a tax ID and billing contracts, so they may not need your contracts. They will often come in and say, I'm going to buy the assets of your practice. So that's one option. The second option is if someone is maybe newer in the market and they don't have a lot of those relationships, they may choose to try to buy the stock or membership interests of your company so that they can step into the tax ID and better be able to bill. I'll give one caveat on a structure that is sort of a hybrid of that we're seeing more and more of. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but we see a number of buyers now that have a structure where they require you to basically reorganize your practice prior to the time of sale so that you keep a piece of ownership afterwards and the buyer buys a majority. So I won't get into the details of the reorganization, but I might come to you, Chad, and say, hey, I'd love to buy your practice, but you're one of the workhorses behind this. I expect you to stay around and I'd like to keep you motivated to do that. So we'll go through this reorganization and I'll ultimately end up buying 70%, but you're going to keep your 30% and help us to grow this, because in the Harrisburg market, they don't know Paul Welk from Pittsburgh, but they know Chad and he can drive the value of that. So we see that on a number of deals that we're working on. That's very common these days.
Very fair. I don't see any other questions right now. The other thing that you and I talked about before, which was you're a transactional attorney, right? So I know we have owners on here that are looking to potentially buy and merge with practices in their area. And I know we have practices that are also looking to sell, and they're thinking about that and they need to get their ducks in a row. What's the best way to contact you if somebody needs your help?
Sure. Either by phone or email. I don't know if you've got my contact information somewhere, Chad, that you can flip it out. But my email is pwelk@tuckerlaw.com, or my phone, my direct dial is 412-594-5536. So I'd be happy to talk to anybody about what you're contemplating if you have something that you want to bounce off somebody, you can track me down.
Yeah. And this is an unsolicited plug for Paul and his firm. And by the way, every time that somebody asks, so what I used to do when somebody would ask me for your contact is I had a contact card, but I had you in my phone twice, once with your cell number. And I think I shared that a couple of times, and I was like, the other one is like almost like a business card that's in the phone. I forget what it's called. So then I learned how to get rid of that. The other thing that I'll say is there's some confusion between, for lack of a better term, a broker or an agent, which we've had on at these events as well, and they're fantastic in terms of taking some of the workload off of going through a transaction, whether you're doing an internal sale or external sale. I've gone through an internal sale on multiple occasions, went from 100% in 2012, and over the last 8 or 9 years, I've sold off about 36%. Paul and his firm have walked us through the entire way, through the steps, and they've actually have helped us from all ends. It was very amicable, and we just laid out the terms, and they just took care of that. And it's at a fraction of the cost if I was somehow like using another outside broker in order to sell internally. So it's make sure you're legally protected when you're going through a transaction, whether you're buying or selling. And again, I know nobody else in the space that is even close to you in terms of deal flow or knowledge base. So thank you for being here and sharing tremendously, sharing your vast knowledge. Thanks, Paul.
Oh, no problem. I appreciate the invitation. I always enjoy talking to this group. So thanks for having me.
A couple other things for you. First one is a comment from Stacy Schatz. Paul Welk was a huge asset when I went through a partnership. Shannon asked, for owners who aren't looking to sell in the next 5 years, is it worth getting a practice valuation, getting EBITDA calculated, et cetera, just to have a baseline?
I think that it is. And first, thanks, Stacy. It's good to see your note come up there. Hope all is well with you. I think it's very helpful, because I think sometimes folks don't have any idea what their practice is worth. So ultimately, if you're going to, for example, sell internally, and you're thinking that the practice is worth something, we see a lot of, not a lot, that may not be fair. We see a number of internal sales that don't work just because the parties are thinking the valuations are that different, or the practice is worth so much. I mean, as you can imagine, if you have a newer grad who just bought a house, who's got a couple of kids at home and is paying off mortgages and tuition bills, and you say to them, I'd love to have you buy in, 20% is going to cost you $200,000 or whatever. For most people, that's probably a short discussion. So I think having that education piece, I think is very helpful. A lot of your accountants can, probably at least give you an idea of valuation, or, there are a number of folks out there that work to value PT businesses.
Yeah. And I think that's very agreeable. The other thing that I want to say is so you might not be looking to sell within the next 5, but even if it's 15 years down the road, Shannon, you don't magically wake up in the year 2036 and let's say you have a number, $1 million or $3 million or whatever you think the practice should be worth at that point. You're not going to just magically calculate EBITDA at that future point and have the practice. You have to start understanding the drivers to EBITDA and what your revenue and costs look like as well. And the EBITDA exercise helps with that tremendously. We did get a couple other questions in here, Paul. I'm going to capture these because we're at time. But last question for you. Do you have this book, Jim Collins?
I don't. Should I?
Are you an Audible? You're a runner, so do you listen to Audible?
Yeah, I'm a runner. So is that what I should listen to in my next run? Well, not a long run, but yeah.
I can mail you a copy of this, or I can send you an Audible.
All right, I'll take an Audible and I'll put it on.
We'll get this to you. Thanks for being here, Paul. If you can give Paul some love in the chat, that would be great. and we'll try to capture your other questions and get Paul to answer these in the future.
All right. Hope everybody has a great meeting. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Paul. See you.
Awesome. All right. Up next, we're going to do a partner presentation from Breakthrough Manual Therapy and Haynes Dry Needling. And then we will get back to the Wheel of Names and do our next giveaway.
Up here, Breakthrough Manual Therapy. Let's talk about second, third rib dysfunction today. So your patient has any type of cervical pain, cervicogenic headache, maybe they have some radiculopathic symptoms going down their arm. You need to look at second, third rib. Okay, with the second, third rib, okay, we're looking at the biomechanics and any rotational dysfunction. Jesse, can you lay on your left side for me? Actually, yep, stay right there. Okay. Okay, so a little mobilization. Second, third rib, extremely important in cervical dysfunction. This is just one of the things that you're going to learn in the Breakthrough Manual courses. Really excited about the courses and the comp certification that we put together for you. So you can get certified orthopedic manual therapist certification through Breakthrough. There's 4 courses that are required that we have put together for you. These courses are built specifically for you as a practice owner to get your clinic up to speed to where patients are going out and they're screaming your name. These aren't continuing education classes. We built these classes on techniques and a system that's used every day in the Madden and the NEF physical therapy clinics. Okay, so on Saturday, go to your partner's page, look up Abby for Breakthrough Manual Therapy. She'll get you hooked up with one of the courses. So really good time to set goals for 2021. So make it a goal to get yourself and your clinic comp certified. Happy New Year.
Hi, this is Luke Haynes with the Haynes PT Institute. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our Haynes method of neuromuscular dry needling. A lot of clinicians involved here with GrowthX and Breakthrough do have some experience with dry needling. There's a lot of dry needling instruction that's available out there. But I want to tell you a little bit about why I feel like ours is different and how it can benefit your practice and your clinicians as well. So one of the things that we have done because of COVID, we've all had to deal with the change in the ability to get together for extended periods of time and so forth, is to take our 3-course, 64-hour dry needling certification program, and we've condensed it into a virtual hybrid approach. Now, what that means is we're still going to have half of the content is going to be lecture. That lecture is now on an online basis. It is live, it is synchronous for those that aren't able to attend the class for whatever reason that can be made up through watching the live sessions. What we will do is this program is going to take about almost 12 months to complete. Every 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to have a 2-hour lecture. It's usually going to fall on a Monday evening, 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. And the format is the first 4 lectures will comprise the initial introductory information. That information is going to give your clinicians everything they need to then attend the first of 4 8-hour in-person live dry needling lab sessions. The reason we do this up front after the first 4 is we want to get that basic dry needling experience under their belt. It's very important to get comfortable with the technique. Your patients really need to see how convenient, how comfortable it can be, and to see the dramatic changes that can happen with dry needling. Once we finish that piece, then we're going to move on to 12 additional 2-hour lectures, again, all online, with, again, live and synchronous. And then at the conclusion of that, towards the end of the program, then we will meet a second time. This will be a 3-day total of 24 hours of in-person extensive lab session. At the conclusion, your clinicians will be certified in the full gamut of dry needling. My program, again, it's 64 hours. So what that means is it is not just an introductory course, but you get the introduction as well as all of the advanced dry needling techniques, including, and what our emphasis is on, is diagnosis specific dry needling. So we'll cover a lot of the perineural dry needling, a lot of the things that we're going to see every day clinically. So one of the questions that people always ask me is, how does this, as a practice owner, how does this benefit me? Well, number one, it gives you another stream of cash. At this point, dry needling is not a reimbursable modality or technique. And so a lot of our clinicians do find that what they will do is institute some sort of a cash payment option for this. And we can discuss that in a little bit more detail. We do have some dry needling codes. Unfortunately, there's no value assigned to them. So it does provide a nice cash infusion into the practice for that. The second question is about patient retention and then new patients. What I've found is that our patients that are treated through dry needling, through my approach, do a great job of getting a quick reduction in their pain. And quite honestly, that's as therapists, that's what we're looking for. We want to knock that pain down. We want to get them then moving into the second and third stages of healing. And so that is a great way to get not only your current patients to retain, but because they know how well you can deal with their pain situation, they will be back. My experience in my clinics is that our patients know what we do, and through this dry needling, they can expect some great results. As far as new patients, that word of mouth marketing is one of the greatest things that we see. This patient had a great response. They tell their friends, their family, and it takes just a little bit of time before you to be the expert in the area of dealing with pain, dealing with lack of function. So if you would like to have a little bit more information, I'd love to talk with you. You can reach me at through our website, through our social media pages, and I hope to see you for our next virtual live dry needling class.
Awesome. That was Luke Haynes from Haynes PT and Dana from Breakthrough Manual Therapy. We're going to do one more giveaway. Just checking what we're giving away. Not an Amazon gift card this time. We're actually going to be giving away AirPods. Let's see who the lucky winner is. Remember, you have to be on to be eligible to win. Mike. Let's see if Mike is here. Can you raise your hand, Mike? He is here. Perfect. Awesome, Mike. I will be in touch with you after today's event to get you your new AirPods. All right, Chad, Bob, take it away.
All right. And Lauren, I know the degree of difficulty on delivering the